Hello, Omri here, and we are going to go through the new promise lab and a potential solution to it. So here's our sleep.js that is currently empty, and our job is to create something that returns a promise that waits for a certain number of time. So let's create our sleep function. You're supposed to spell const right for whatever reason. And then we'll say wait time is here. And knowing that it returns a promise, and knowing that our job in this lab is to use the promise constructor, this sleep function takes a parameter and returns a new promise. That's a good place to start. Now we'll fill in this dot dot dot. But this is the thing to get, that we take some wait time, we return a new promise. Now, the promise constructor works in a very particular way. It takes a function, and it passes that function two methods, resolve and reject. And we can call them whatever we want. We could call these thing1 and thing2, or Tweedledee and Tweedledum. You get the idea. But resolve and reject are good names for them. Because what they do is if we invoke resolve, it will resolve the promise we are constructing. If we invoke reject, it will reject the promise we are constructing. So our job inside of this callback is to do something. So wait for a certain amount of time, then resolve. Or potentially reject, and we'll talk about that one. But we should do one of those things. So let's set timeout, because that's a tool that we can use in JavaScript to wait for a certain amount of time. And the certain amount of time we're going to wait for is the argument that they passed in here. So sleep takes a certain amount of time to wait for, and then we pass that here. This callback function to set timeout is something that also works in a particular way. This will execute when that certain amount of time has completed. So it's at this point that we want to call resolve. If we call resolve here, this is our way of saying the promise is now logically complete. The operation is over and the promise has fulfilled. And this is our solution to sleep. This should do what we want. Something you'll notice is that we haven't used reject here, and that's because there's not exactly a reason for this promise to reject. So if we have a set timeout and we say, hey, in 500 milliseconds resolve, there's no reason that we have to reject. There's no reason we have to say, no, this promise failed for some reason. We could invent one. We could invent a reason, but as it stands, this is what we have. There are other, I could show another promisification example that would have a reason to fail. So we could imagine a promisified read file. So here's our promisified read file. This is a function that takes a file path, and we'll use fs.readFile, the ordinary one, to pass it that file path, and fs.readFile takes a callback. All right, so this is in general what we're going to do, but because we know that promisified read file is supposed to return a promise, we should start with return new promise. And return new promise, again, takes a callback. This is the executor function of the promise, which it runs. And that executor function receives two functions, resolve and reject. So inside of fs.readFile, given the file path, the way that fs.readFile's callback works is that it takes an error or the file contents. So now we can do something inside of the callback, because here is logically where the promise for the read file that we're trying to do should settle. Now, if there was an error, we can reject, and this is a reason to reject. We can say if the read file failed, well, then we should reject the promise for reading that file. Let me just pull in fs to make sure this part is accurate. So now otherwise, if there was no error, then we are supposed to resolve, as in the promise logically fulfilled. It was successful with the, contents was what I called this thing. So here's what we've got. We've got now promisified read file that takes a file path, returns a new promise that, with this executor function, will start reading the file right now. when that file read completes, if there was an error, it will reject the promise we are constructing. If there was no error, it will resolve the promise we are constructing. That's what's going on here. And again, this was an example that uses reject. It's just the sleep was what we were doing in the lab. I just wanted to show another example that would use reject. Thank you.